Chapter 21 of sdm4 is really about wisdom about tests and intervals. And it thinks about how we can think about choosing hypotheses and interpreting p-values, dealing with things like alpha levels, critical values, and then really errors we can be making in testing. So choosing hypotheses is the first kind of component of this, and there's some descriptions of this. There's a one-sided versus two argument here. Again, I would argue there's really never a good time or place for one-sided tests, and we don't see them in practice, so I don't know why books talk about them in the same kind of way. That's a little bit of my thing. Questions about what to do with p-values is really important because they are easily misinterpreted. So this is a really important kind of discussion here. The think, show, and tell. The mechanics are pretty straightforward. The question about interpretation is actually even more vexing. If you have a high p-value, you're not really sure necessarily what to do. This may just really mean that there's not much evidence to contradict the null, and that can happen for a couple of reasons, as laid out here. Alpha levels are almost always set to 0.05, but this talks about why there might want to be other levels for that, and the idea of the significance level and its relation to the alpha level. Probably most importantly, this idea of practical versus statistical significance is introduced. So critical values are things that are a little bit not as critical anymore, no pun intended. It used to be that people would go around making decisions. They would say, well, if the p-value is less than 0.05, I will reject, and they wouldn't actually report the p-value. It's really important to always report the p-value along with a confidence interval when you do a test as a way of giving the reader a complete sense of what's going on. This section 21.4 talks a little bit about that. It talks about confidence intervals for small samples. Again, less critical. There are much better approaches now to be dealing with some of these. The exact binomial inference I mentioned would be better. So this agresti cool plus 4, that's what your parents or maybe your older brother might have had to do instead of something more reasonable and exact. Errors. We'll always be making errors. One of the challenges of being a statistician is we never know whether we're right. So this section 21.5 is really important. This figure I would definitely encourage you to take a close look at and thinking about finding ways of sample size and power and how we can balance some of these things. Effect size is really kind of a measure of how strong an effect is, and that's actually described in this. It's related to some of these aspects of power. And this idea really is always, drawing a picture is really, really valuable. When you do think about power calculations, this kind of what's going on under the alternative, what's going on under the null, can be very valuable as a way of making those insights. We can reduce both type 1 and type 2 errors, but it generally requires more data. We can shift from one to the other in various fashions, and that's really described in these sections. So what goes wrong? Again, lots of things. Testing can be really hard for people. Lots of important learning outcomes. There's no R code here. This is really thinking in general about ways that tests can go right.